The subject of Buddha nature is interesting to me because it's a philosophical concept in Buddhism that isn't very well understood, I think. And I wrote about it. I'm trying to write a new book, but it's sort of, I don't know, it's just a bunch of scattered little pieces that don't really add up to anything. They're just kind of little things. And I spent a lot of time a couple of months ago trying to write about Buddha nature. And I thought I would present it to this group and see if it does anything. So this is a little bit, have you ever seen, I don't know, sometimes stand-up comedians will do a show in a smaller city or something, and they try to use their material and see if it works. So that's what I'm doing. Not that you're a small group, but just I just want to see if this makes any sense to anybody. So we're kind of familiar with the idea of a soul, right? Even if you don't believe in it, you've heard people talk about it, and this idea is kind of common in, it's hard to say, it's definitely common in Christianity and similar to certain ideas in Hinduism, which is this idea that your real person is this kind of ghost, not Geist exactly. I like the German word Geist, and a lot of English speakers love the German word Geist because we don't have a word like it, because it's not quite the same as spirit or soul, or, it's different. Or ghost, which is obviously related word. But it's like that's the idea of the soul is usually this thing, this immaterial something that lives in your body and then departs at the time of death. When I used to, when I was younger, follow the Hare Krishnas around, the Hare Krishnas. They have them here, and they actually they show you what it looks like, what the soul looks like. They have paintings and drawings that show you what it looks like, and it's this little guy that lives right here. They're very specific about it, and he's your real personality. Or he or she, I guess it's sort of non-gendered, whatever it is. But at the moment of death, it leaves and then goes to find another body. And this idea must have been around in Buddha's time because he rejected it, and it's kind of a famous thing. If you study Buddhism, one of the first things they would tell you if you took a class in university about Buddhism, they would tell you that Buddha taught the idea of anatman. And atman is that soul, and an is just a way of negating it. So there's no soul, anatman. And instead he said there's 5 skandhas. And actually when we, that thing we chant in the morning, the Heart Sutra, goes through the 5 skandhas. Of course, if you're not familiar with it in your own language, you wouldn't notice it. But it's oh God, now I can't remember. But it doesn't really. Well, let me. It's written in here, so maybe I can tell you the part that actually is the 5 skandhas. Maybe not. Can you be such? No, that's not it. No, I can't find it. I always have this trouble if I'm in front of an audience. I can't find things that I can find easily when I'm not. But the 5 skandhas are usually form, feeling, perception, impulses, consciousness. That's the way I learned them. And there's different translations into English of it. But it's this idea that the personality, the personal self, is just a mixture of these 5 things, which is form, which is your material form, feelings, which is feelings, perceptions, sense perceptions. Impulses is the form, feeling, perception. Yeah, impulses is the difficult one because it's actually everybody translates it into English in a different way, and there's probably, I'm sure there must be 10 different German translations for the word too. But it sort of means that your kind of energy towards doing something, like a kind of action, your kind of impulses towards doing something. Unconsciousness. And consciousness is in some philosophies they say consciousness is everything, but in Buddhism consciousness gets kind of stuck on the end of these 5 things, so it's just one of the things. And so that's kind of basic Buddhism. But then, once you get comfortable with that idea, along comes this idea of Buddha nature, which to some people sounds like Buddhism is trying to bring the idea of the soul back into it. And a lot of people sort of reject Buddha nature, the concept of Buddha nature as being this attempt to try to bring that back. But Dogen wrote about Buddha nature, and he wrote this long essay about it in which he tries to explain it, and then I wrote this other one where I tried to explain it, what he says. And he starts off with this phrase that is attributed to Shakyamuni Buddha. All beings totally have the Buddha nature. The Tathagata, that's the Buddha, abides, lives in them constantly without changing at all. And for those of you who care about these kind of things, even though Dogen attributes that and says this is said by Shakyamuni Buddha, he, I'm sure, knew, as people have known for centuries, that the sutra in which that quote appears was written hundreds of years after the Buddha lived. So there's some controversy over whether the Buddha actually said that or not, and people will argue about this endlessly, so I'm just going to leave it there and just tell you that some people do argue whether the Buddha said that or whether it was written by somebody later. There's a school of thought which says the Buddha did say that, but it was not written down until hundreds of years later. And then there's other people who say, no, just somebody else wrote it hundreds of years later and invented it. So that's the controversy. But the characters, the Chinese characters that are used in that sutra to say all beings totally have the Buddha nature could also mean total existence. And so Dogen reinterprets it and says all beings totally exist as the Buddha nature. And he says, remember, the existence described now, which is totally possessed by the Buddha nature, is beyond the existence of existence and non-existence. And phrases like that drive people crazy when they read Buddhism. I don't know. This joke probably won't work here, but I'll tell it anyway. There's a show. Maybe you guys have seen it. Very popular on the History Channel in America called Ancient Aliens. It's a show where so some of you've seen it, where they talk about the pyramids or Stonehenge and then say, oh, maybe aliens built this and stuff like that. And there's a kind of meme on the internet of the main guy from that show saying, I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. And to me, it's like, that sounds like Buddhism, the existence of, what does he say? Let me read this again. The existence described now is beyond the existence of existence and non-existence. It's like, I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. But what he's trying to say there is that we think of existence as contrasted with non-existence. So Buddhism is in Zen Buddhism is trying to kind of point to this idea of something that can't be described in either way. So existence and non-existence are kind of two ways of describing the same thing, which is not the way our minds work, because logic, what is it, Aristotelian logic or something, that the whole Western civilization is founded on this concept of logic, which says that maybe some of you know better than me if you're philosophy people. It's like A cannot equal B or something like that. So things cannot be their opposite. But in Buddhism, one of the great things that I love about Dogen is he always says things can be their opposite. And he's trying to kind of say that language forces us to kind of choose between two options. And that's, I think, based on a kind of survival mechanism of us as animals. We have to choose whether to, the mouse that people were looking at just now has to choose whether to run away or stay, So you have to kind of make a choice as which is better for survival. And just because that sort of thinking is so deeply embedded in us, we have a difficulty, maybe it's impossible, to think in a way that doesn't involve that process of on or off or yes or no. I think some of the concepts in Buddhism are so difficult because they're trying to get you to notice an area which is not thinking. So no matter how hard you try to think about some of these ideas, you'll just it isn't possible. It's not like I used to feel like, I'm too dumb to understand this, but it isn't. It's just impossible to understand it. And that's the whole point. You're trying to point out that something can be true even though it doesn't fit our on-off logic system. That's what I wrote there in some somewhat better way. But here's another strange thing that Dogen says in this essay. He says, "The whole universe is utterly without objective molecules. Here and now, there is no second person at all." And that line just gives me like chills when I read it, because I think, he's saying something here that's important, even if I don't understand it. And then I might take this out of the thing I wrote, but I'm going to tell you anyway, and maybe it's boring, but I think it's interesting. They translate this word molecules, and when I look at something like this, I go, this is written in, 800 years ago. Nobody thought about molecules. What is he really saying? And the word is actually kaku, which is that's not the word. Chiri, kaku is different. Chiri, which is usually translated as dust, but it's an idea of like the smallest particle of anything. So I think translating it as molecules is fair. It just doesn't sound like something from that time period. But the question is, I wrote a whole bunch of stupid things here, and then I'm going to skip that. What does this line, "no second person at all," mean? That's the part. And no objective molecules. So the idea of there's not anything objective. Everything is subjective. And there's no second person at all. Well, most of us would say there's lots of second persons and third persons and billion persons. So what does he mean by that? And in a different translation of Dogen, not the one by my teacher, there's a footnote and it says, "That is, upon one's spiritually awakening to Buddha nature, the distinction of self and other disappears." And I read that footnote and I thought, well, yeah, okay, that's a good way to put it. But it's sort of, I think also misses the point, because it's not that upon spiritual awakening the distinction of self and others disappears. It's more, I think what Dogen would probably want to say is that the distinction of self and others was always false. And so nothing changes, but sometimes doing this practice, one starts to notice that the distinction of self and others disappears. But you have to be careful with ideas like this, because if you apply them wrongly, then you can make a big mistake. Because this distinction of self and others is false, but it's also something that we as humans have to. It's necessary for us to establish that distinction and be clear about it. Or else things in the world of human beings start to go very wrong. I start to go, self and others, the distinction between self and others disappears. That means I can take Aneta's credit card and use it, because it's my credit card too, right? No self, no others. Or I think of, that's a funny example, but I think of people like Charles Manson, who had this, weird ideas based on misunderstanding Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies, that he could do anything he wanted because everything was him. And then, of course, he commits murders and terrible things. So you don't want to misunderstand this idea, because it's one of these things where the contradiction is actually true. There is no self and others, but you always have to make a clear distinction between self and others. It sounds like more crazy Buddhism. It's not aliens, but it's aliens. But it's kind of like that. And Dogen also says in this essay, he says, no person has ever recognized the direct cutting of the root, for when does the busy movement of karmic consciousness ever cease? And that's a weird phrase, but he's trying to say something I think that my teacher said in a different way, and I think it's the same thing. We'd have to ask Dogen if he agrees, and that's impossible, but I think it's the same thing. Which is somebody, my teacher, Nishijima Roshi, was giving a lecture one time, and somebody started using the phrase, how do we recognize our own enlightenment? How do we recognize enlightenment? And he just said, you can never recognize your own enlightenment. And I remember sitting there thinking, what? You can never recognize your own enlightenment? Then why am I here? Why am I doing all this stupid practice if I can never recognize my own enlightenment? But it's true in a way. You can't stand outside of it and go, okay, that's enlightenment. It's sort of like trying to look at your own eyes. You can't look at your own eyes. You can look at, I'm taking a video of my eyes, so I could look at the video or I could look at a mirror, but you never actually see your own eyes. And I think that's a good metaphor about this idea, is you can't recognize it, because that's where you begin. That's where you come from. That's who you are, actually. Let's see. I'm kind of picking and choosing in what I'm writing, so it's. I hope this is coming out clearly, but I'll just keep going on. Dogen has this other phrase here. He says, this doesn't mean that the substantial world is existence itself. I'm not sure how he gets from this one to that one, because I didn't write it down. But I think it's also, it reminds me of a mistake I made when I first tried to understand my teacher, when I first tried to understand Nishijima Roshi. Because he would talk about realism. And he would say, Buddhism is just realism. And I would think, oh, realism, when I understand realism, I think it means this kind of materialistic view of the universe, like this is the real world, be realistic. But he was pointing to something other than that. The substantial world is not existence itself. It's not the whole of existence, this sort of substantial world. He says elsewhere, in a different essay, Dogen says, even the whole universe in 10 directions, which is the everything, is just a small part of the supreme truth of Bodhi, which is the awakened state of the truth. It may be that the truth of Bodhi abounds beyond the universe, which is crazy. But, it goes beyond anything. And I'd like to think of it as this way. And see if this makes any sense to anybody. We're kind of used to the idea that the universe is infinite, or probably infinite, at least very, very big outwardly. Like from here to the next star is 4 light years, 4 point something light years to Proxima Centauri, if you remember that from science class. So that's a long way. And then as they keep putting new telescopes in the sky, they find out the universe is bigger and older than they thought it was. I just remember reading some article, came out recently. They changed the age of the universe again. So I forget what it is now, because they keep discovering it's bigger than they thought it was. And I found this fascinating. As late as the 1920s, when astronomers first sort of figured out that there was a galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy we call it, they thought that was the universe, that was it. And then, surprise, they found out, oh my God, there's other galaxies. And then they had to, revise their idea of the size of the universe. And I like to think that probably, we think of that as outer, but I think the inner universe is actually just as big, So Dogen is kind of pointing to concepts like that. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm on drugs.
Are you?
No. But sometimes I think it's funny that the things that people who are like high, I had conversations when I was a teenager, when I was getting high with my friends, that sound a whole lot like Buddhist conversations now, and I go, oh wow, maybe it's the same thing. What if the color red that you see is not the same as the color red that I see? Like those kind of conversations. It sounds like Buddhism. Anyway, sorry. So here's where Dogen starts to get into whether Buddha nature is the same as this idea of Atman. And he says, many students have misunderstood Buddha nature to be like the self described by the non-Buddhist Seneca. And Seneca is not the same as the Greek philosopher Seneca. It's an Indian philosopher who, the Buddhists always contrast themselves against. And he says, this is because they do not meet themselves and they do not meet with a teacher. And this is another, sorry to give you another language lesson, but I just noticed this about 5 or 6 years ago when I was working on some book about Dogen. And it's something I still haven't seen anybody else who writes about Dogen mention. So I invented this, and I'm a genius. But I'm surprised nobody mentions this, is that they often, when you read translations of Dogen, this word self comes up a lot. But Dogen actually uses several words that are translated as self. And there's two main words that he uses. And one is ware, and the other is jiko. And they are both in Japanese just kind of normal, everyday words. Ware is a little bit old-fashioned. Normally, I think these days people use the word watashi instead of ware. But it usually just means me in a sentence, like if you ever learn basic Japanese, watashi no namae wa Brad desu. My name is Brad. So watashi no namae is name, so my name, so that watashi is me. And in the old days, the same, they would say ware instead of watashi. And the other word he uses is jiko, and jiko is still used very commonly in Japanese. The best example is jiko shokai. One of the first phrases I learned in Japanese was jiko shokai, which means self-introduction. If you say my name, like I just said, I just did a jiko shokai. My name is Brad. That's a jiko shokai. Introducing yourself and telling I'm from America and whatever. Did anybody study Japanese in here? Okay, yeah. So you've heard this stuff. So it's just kind of basic Japanese stuff. And when Dogen says jiko, he's talking about this a much bigger concept of self, like the self that is the self of the whole universe. And when he says ware, he's talking about the individual self. And so when you read a sentence like this, he's saying, he's using both of these words, but when you translate it into English, it doesn't come across. So many students have misunderstood Buddha nature to be like the self, ware, described by the non-Buddhist Seneca. This is because they do not meet themselves, and that self is jiko. They do not meet jiko, and they do not meet with a teacher. So that's the difference there. So there's this idea, this is the idea that's hard to explain, because Atman also means self. And so some people will tell you that Buddhism has an idea of non-self, no self. But then Buddhism also has this idea of self that is the self of the universe. And again, these are contradictions. And some people, I've read this in some places, will say, well, this is Mahayana Buddhism is the one that has the idea of big self, and they'll say, well, Mahayana Buddhism is a corruption of real Buddhism. This is the non-Mahayana Buddhists will say this. And real Buddhism says there's no self, but these Mahayana jerks just tried to put self back into the thing. But I think that's a mistake. I think it's actually in there in both forms of Buddhism, but they express it differently. So what the hell does that mean? Well, Dogen does try to explain this, so I'll tell you what he says. He says, where does he say this? He says, mind, will, and consciousness are the movement of wind and fire. And this is just a really old-fashioned way of saying this is the material elements at work. Wind, because they didn't really have sophisticated concepts of energy and things like we do now. So they would just call it all wind and fire. But when they're saying wind and fire, they just mean the kind of activities of the physical activities of the brain and stuff. That's what he says, mind, will, and consciousness are that. But the Buddha nature is something else. I should rewrite this essay because it's kind of messy. That's what I'm realizing now. But anyway, he he kind of gets into this idea of enlightenment at this point, when people think they understand it. And Dogen is always kind of his strategy in his writings is whenever you think you understand him, he'll tell you you're wrong. So when he talks about enlightenment, he says, "Whoever said that enlightened knowing and enlightened understanding are present in Buddha nature?" So understanding and knowing is something different. This is back to that idea of you can't notice your own enlightenment. But he gives us kind of advice about what to do instead. Wanting to know the meaning of the Buddha nature, we should just reflect real-time causes and circumstances. When the time has come, the Buddha nature is manifest before us. So he's saying kind of, and he always says this, there is no enlightenment out there or enlightenment that's in the future. It's just noticing this world that we live in and this person that we are as they really are. And this can happen anytime. And so he says that when the time has come means that there has never been any time which is not the time having come, nor any Buddha nature which was not the Buddha nature manifesting itself before us. So everything we see and everything we experience is this Buddha nature. And he quotes an old Buddhist sutra that says, "The mountains, rivers, and the earth, all relying on it," which the it means, in this case, Buddha nature, are constructed. So the mountains, rivers, and the earth are made out of Buddha's nature. And then he gets really poetic. He says that to look at mountains and rivers is to look at the Buddha nature, and to look at the Buddha nature is to look at a donkey's jaw or a horse's nose. And these, of course, are things that would have been very common things to see in his time. We don't see that many donkeys and horses in our day unless you live in a farm. But if you were in Dogen's time, it would be like, and I don't know. What's something everybody sees every day? A chair or a car or something, just something you see every day. That's Buddha nature. And he says, our own experiences are Buddha nature, including our experience of doubting Buddha nature. And he says that doubt is Buddha nature returning to me. And then, I'm sorry, I'm getting boring here, but this is where it gets weird. Let me just read it. One famous saying about this says, all living beings have the Buddha nature. The phrase living beings sometimes trips people up. Dogen defines living beings by saying that all those that have mind are living beings, for minds are just living beings, which is fine, but then he says, those without mind may also be living beings, for living beings are just minds. So he's saying it's not, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens. Grass, trees, and national lands are mind itself, and because they are mind, they are living beings. And because they are living beings, they have the Buddha nature. And he also includes the sun, the moon, and the stars, and everything else as mind. But then he says that saying they have Buddha nature is extra. He says we should say all living beings are Buddha nature. And this living beings, remember, includes things we don't think of as being alive at all. And then he says, we do not always understand ourselves, the truth with which we are equipped. We don't always understand the truth that we are living in. I know that's all weird,